always feel after that kind of introduction, I said this a couple of times, so I'm not repeating myself to you. After that kind of introduction, I'm thinking, it can only be downhill from here. And I'm thinking, really, I should just sit down, maybe flick through a few slides and leave it at that. On the 20th of August 1908, the German chemical company Meister, Lucius and Brunning, MLB, as I'll probably refer to them through much of the talk, produced their first batch of synthetic indigo at their Ellesmere port works. It was also the first batch of synthetic indigo produced in Britain. That thought is just worth hanging on to it'll come up again as we go through the talk. However, 5 years later, in August 1914, when Britain entered World War I, the works were sequestrated by Sir William Plender, Controller of Companies Department of the Board of Trade, on behalf of the British government. The works were subsequently sold to Levenstein on the 28th of August 1916, so almost, not quite, almost 100 years ago. And remarkably, just 3 months later, the plant was repaired, made fully operational, and had produced the first batch of synthetic indigo by a British company. And what I'm going to try and do over the next half hour or so is to get this to work. Oh. Okay. It was working. I don't have a solution.
Daniel, expert. You now appear in your own video.
It was working on here. It was working
50 years of the computer.
Okay, so back to the talk. What I'm going to try and cover in half an hour, so you have to forgive me if I kind of skirt through some of this, but I'm going to have a look at these various aspects. First of all, many of you may know the German dominance in synthetic dyestuff sector, a little bit of the background to that. I'm then going to have a look at the British patent system, not in fine detail, but just as it affects this story that I'm trying to portray this afternoon. Then look at the establishment of the Ellesmere port works and the demands of World War I, and then very briefly wrap up by talking about the implications for that post-war period. I'm not bringing it right up to very recent times, but nevertheless try and draw it to a conclusion. Natural indigo. The indigo was a revered dye for many, many millennia. It was known as the king of colours. And it was something that, or a colour, that every ruler wanted to have their cloaks dyed in, whatever else. It was always the colour. It was obtained, and the name in fact derives, as I've shown here, indigo fera. So indigo, or Indi, means India, because that's where the main supplies actually came from, and fera, which is fairer to produce. India, as I said, was the main source of indigo for Britain, and in India there was something like 1.5 million acres under cultivation. And not surprisingly, therefore, it was a crucial part of Indian agriculture, but also the economy. We look, I just looked at 1 year, as it were, And the trade between India and Britain reached a peak in 1896-7, when 9,367 tonnes worth, at that time about 3.5 million pounds, were actually exported to Britain. What about synthetic dye, synthetic indigo? As you remember, the first synthetic dye was discovered by William Perkin in 1856. It's called mauve. And later in 59, he'd been doing some further work and discovered another synthetic dye, Ellesmere. When he went to patent it, he found that 3 German research scientists, had already patented, in fact, the day before. And this is often marked by historians as the time when any major grasp and driving of the synthetic dye industries and discoveries switched from Britain to Germany. And Germany built on this, as we shall see, over the next 50, 60, 70 years. Again, indigo was thought to be the kind of holy grail. If they could get the synthetic dye identified and then provide a process route so they could produce it in large quantities, this was going to be hugely valuable to them economically. And so, amongst many of the outstanding German chemists of the time, went through a series of developments. In 1870, Bayer and Emmerling obtained indigo in very low yield, and really, although certain companies like BASF and MLB tried to find process routes, they really weren't particularly economic. But that didn't stop them, and various other attempts were made, some of them using toluene, but again, very expensive raw material. And we shouldn't forget, although the Germans were in the lead in terms of these synthetic dye stuff, it was in fact the Swiss as well who were driving some of the research forward. And Karl Humann at the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich found a route that started from naphthalene. Naphthalene is a much cheaper, much easier material to use from an economic point of view. In 1890, again, Humann's work continued, and he developed a route from aniline. But the yield was poor. And then, in 1901, a scientist, Flegger at Degussa, actually discovered a way of increasing the yield and getting it up to 75%. And that became the model, really, for the industrial manufacture of synthetic indigo. And as we see in the bottom part there, MLB and many other companies registered German and British patents, and they set up works in Germany and France. You notice no works in Britain. Another point to hold on to for a while. This is the route. It's starting off from aniline. And this is the Flegger stage with sodamine, NH2, and that produced this very high yield, went up to about 75%. Degussa, you may have heard of. They had a considerable notoriety, not in the First World War, but in the Second World War, where, of course, that was the company that supplied Xylon B, which was used, cyanide derivative that was used in the gas chambers in the various extermination camps. So here we have the Germans and the Swiss making huge strides, and the German chemical industry beginning to kind of put that process into full-scale production, not just in Germany, but across Europe, except for Britain. So how did India respond to this? Did they just kind of give up altogether? It was considered that the best way of approaching the India situation was try and put it on a more scientific footing. As you could imagine, it had been a kind of craft trade almost for centuries, decades, millennia possibly. And therefore some further enhancement through scientific investigation might in fact help to increase the yield and provide at least some competitive basis against synthetic indigo. There was some research set up in India, which has been widely written about if you want to read up about that. And there was some work done here in the British University Chemistry Department, particularly at Leeds, E.C. Green, and then 1905, 1907 by Popplewell Bloxham. When this information was put into the reports and taken back to India, as you might expect, the Indian producers, growers, processors, they didn't understand the scientific aspect, and therefore they couldn't see any of the benefits that might accrue from adopting it. And so, pretty much, they gave up on that, and they just didn't pursue them particularly hard. By 1917, was pretty much a view around that, as far as the Indian natural indigo was concerned, there was really no way, given the extent of the development of the German industry on the synthetic side, that the natural indigo could return. Now, of course, it has since on a very small scale, but we may come back to that a little later on. One of the problems here was, and you noticed before I was mentioning that when MLB set up their various works, there was one in Germany, one in France, but none in Britain. And there was nothing in the patents that they took out here, the British patents, that required them to work the processes. And this led a lot of the prominent dye manufacturers here in the UK and Britain to really a challenge on that. And it all revolved around patent reform. Now this can be a fairly turgid subject, so I'm going to give you the very kind of basics of it. There's plenty to read about, there's volumes to read about if you're really interested. And just to say that I am looking at it purely from the dyestuffs standpoint this afternoon. The person, to my mind, who led much of the campaign against the existing dyestuff legislation here in Britain was Ivan Levenstein. Levenstein was born in Germany, but he came to Manchester in 1864 with the specific purpose of setting up a laboratory and also a factory at Blakely. You probably know of Blakely, an important part that that site plays in the history of dyestuffs manufacture. By the early 1880s, as I was saying before, it was very evident that to British manufacturers that Britain had lost its preeminence. When you think about it, it's probably even before 1880, but that's often the accepted kind of period. Levenstein was a vociferous opponent of free trade and supported protectionism of empire trade. Now again, one can drift into all the political side of this, but many of you know the history of that period, particularly in Parliament and amongst manufacturers. There was a very, very strong view that all trade should be free of any import duties, any other controls. But increasingly, as we get into this kind of period towards the 1900s, was a ferocious discussion and arguments and debates in Parliament about these kind of issues. And in a sense, that provides another context, because obviously any change of legislation is going to be effected through parliamentary action and parliamentary decision making. For Levenstein, the demise of the natural indigo trade was just unthinkable. And he used that in part to try and garner support to get some of the patent legislation changed. He wisely worked with the Manchester Chamber of Commerce, formed a very, very strong lobbying group, and of course you can imagine the preeminence of Manchester at that time, almost right the way through the 19th century, as a major industrial centre. And Levenstein pointed out that none of the 600 British patents for coal-tar dyes granted to foreigners between 1891 and 1895 were being worked in Britain. This was quite a serious situation, he felt. It made it much, much more difficult to get any licenses to operate the plant. There was no stipulation on the companies registering the particular process that they had to work in here. And again, there was a mounting view that this should be changed. And representations were made to David Lloyd George, who was then president of the Board of Trade. And they began to see some shift in position. This is Ivan Levenstein on the left. Wonderful moustache, I would think. And this is his son, Herbert, on the right. Ivan played a really principal part in Levenstein's probably until the beginning of the war, First World War. Herbert at that point begins to take over, and that's why in the talk I'm not trying to go into details as which of these people was actually doing what when, but I tend to just look at it as far as Levenstein, otherwise it would become much more difficult to follow. Again, it was immensely difficult getting these changes. The controller of the Patent Office was a very powerful individual, and the London patent agents as well. And they fought tooth and nail at any of these kind of changes. Because we're just looking here, well certainly today, at the dye-stuff sector and the particular issues they were facing. What they were looking at is patents right across the board. And the key thing was this working clause. And there was an amendment of the Patent Law Amendment Act of 1902, and I put there in the third line this kind of change in the working clause. If any new industry is prejudiced by the failure of a patentee to work his patent here or to grant licenses, he may be compelled to do so by the court or have his patent revoked. So in other words, they were now putting much, much more pressure onto the foreign manufacturers to come in here and start working their processes, using the raw materials, selling the goods within the country, and also making licenses available at a reasonable rate. At this point, of course, MLB and the other company had a complete monopoly. They could charge whatever they want in terms of exporting the synthetic indigo into this country. But again, there was, it wasn't the final story in a sense, because compulsory licenses were not easy to get. And they gave them a period of 3 years to actually get some process up and running. And they found, in fact, that where companies did start to manufacture in Britain, sometimes the licenses were even more difficult to get, as you might expect, and even more expensive. So expensive that it became almost impossible to work that process in an economic fashion. There was further lobbying. This clearly wasn't the final position, and in 1908 there was a new act that provided for any patent more than 4 years old that was not worked or only partially worked to be revoked until the holder could satisfy the comptroller of the patent office of his reason for not working. And that's about as far as it got within the kind of time frame that we're looking at this afternoon. Now, of course, the German chemical companies, as you might expect, were kind of watching this scene from a distance and seeing what the direction of travel was going to be as far as the government and parliament was concerned. And they clearly saw, MLB at least, but also BASF, which is another story, obviously started to initiate creating offices here in Britain. And MLB established a branch in Manchester in 1901 with sales offices in London, Glasgow and Bradford. More importantly, the executive board had members from the German parent company. So this was a serious endeavour. This was not just something kind of token. They meant serious intent. During 1907, MLB drew up plans for a factory to work their Indigo patent at Ellesmere Port. At that time, of course, the Manchester Ship Canal had been constructed, I think around 1894. So it was no problem kind of moving goods around down to that site, and particularly since the site had access, or wharf access on, I'll show you a photograph in a minute, wharf access actually onto the Manchester Ship Canal. It was about 10,000 hectares with a wharf, and the aim initially was to supply the total need of the British market. However, these plans were subsequently scaled back by various legal challenges within the courts. And one of these said that, one of these gentlemen said, you didn't have to provide or produce or manufacture the total UK consumption of the good. You could import part of it, but as long as you produce some of it, and I don't think in the court ruling there was any stipulation about what kind of proportion. So obviously they scaled back a bit. But the first batch of Indigo was produced on the 20th of August 1908, as I said in my introductory remarks, just 8 months from purchase of the land. But if you go into the archives of MLB, the one certainly that have survived, which I've been fortunate enough to look at, everything was treated in the greatest secrecy. The staff and the managers were under very strict instructions from MLB in Germany that visitors are not to be shown any of the details of the plant or any parts of it working, or to nobody is to discuss what kind of materials they're using at the different stages of the process. I often wondered why that was until I delved a little bit further, which I'll come to in a minute. This is a photograph, and sorry, it's not a very good quality, but that's the best that we've got from the MLB archives in Germany. But that shows a site under construction. Doesn't kind of help particularly, but it's just useful to actually have that as a record. And I'll come to another one in a few minutes. I'll come back to that point about that I was just talking about in a minute. But when Britain entered the war in August 1914. Again, as I said in my introduction, the works were sequestrated by the British government. because indigo was such a crucial dye, was absolutely critical to get this works back up and running. Although there were initial attempts to maybe increase the supply of natural indigo from India, and to be fair, there was an increase, but not on a scale that it was going to replace the synthetic indigo. The immediate reaction was some temporary arrangement whereby the MLB manager, who was still at the site, and any of the workers who had not been repatriated to Germany were told to get the works back up and operating again as quickly as possible, which they did. But when they started to put the process into action, they found, in fact, that MLB had been importing for quite a number of years an intermediate product in that reaction chain, process route, multi-stage process. So they didn't work the whole process, they only worked the latter part of it. And what they imported was the phenol glycine, which we saw earlier in the kind of flow chart, and that's where they operated from. Well, if the supplies of phenol glycine now couldn't be brought in from Germany, how are you going to produce indigo? So they had to set about, fairly quickly, finding a company that could actually produce phenol glycine. And they found, in fact, Kellner Alkali Company, which is just down the ship canal at Western Point, but it's connected to the indigo works at Ellesmere. And fortunately, in a time of war, the Kellner were allowed to use the MLB patent, the patent they registered here in Britain, under license from the person who was called the Custodian of Foreign Patents at the parent patent office. But there really needed to be a kind of more permanent solution to this issue. And the permanent one, as they saw it, was to put it under the management and operation of a British company, but a company that could really get the works up and running quickly and meeting the supply demand required. They considered three companies, as I put up here, Levenstein, British Dyes Limited. British Dyes Limited had been formed in 1915, so at the start of the war, when again there was great concern about the British dyestuffs industry, and there was a feeling, well, if it brought some of the companies together, then this might actually strengthen that sector. So they were one of the candidates, based at Huddersfield. In fact, Levenstein was part of that at that stage, and Kellner, that we've just spoken about. In the end, Levenstein's was selected, and they've been doing some research and managed to identify personnel, Dr. Strackler. I've never been able to find out what his Christian name is, but Dr. Strackler, again trained like human at the Zurich Polytechnic, but he managed the French factory, MLB factory at Kriel. So absolutely ideal person to have. They managed to persuade him to come here. They put their own process into action from phenol glycine, and 3 months after acquiring the factory, Levenstein produced its first batch of indigo. There wasn't quite the fanfare that there had been when MLB had produced their first batch of indigo. When they did that, years before, they produced samples of the synthetic indigo in very small barrels and sent it out to prominent people. And they also sent one out to David Lloyd George. And it just said, made in England, in gold, embossing. So they were really grateful, I guess, to David Lloyd George for that ability to kind of produce synthetic indigo here and reap the benefit. This is the overall process at Ellesmere, and I think it's the most likely one. Some of the records aren't particularly detailed on this. This is obviously aniline again. And it goes through those cycles that we've already spoken about, and eventually, again, they're doing the sodium, or the sodiumide rather, and eventually it comes down to indigo, but a slightly longer process path. This is it's an aerial shot of the works in about 1919. Here's the Manchester Ship Canal. Sorry, I couldn't quite, when I was trying to get this framed properly. There is a ship here actually alongside the wall. It gives you a sense of the scale. Looks as if it was winter time. And you can see the usual kind of very tall shipping here. And the works kind of spread out across the site. So, what are the lessons of this experience for the post-war period? There was great concern at the end of the war, at the conclusion of the war, that the German industry, once it got back into action again, would retain its dominance. This came out from various site visits, which are interesting in their own right. I don't have time to go into them today, but a number of people from the chemical industry here went to Germany, went to look at the various chemical industry sites in Germany, particularly around the harbour process, the high pressure processing, to get more intimate details, if you like, of that process. But at the same time, they came back with a view that virtually nothing had been damaged during the war, and that once they were given the go-ahead, then they'd pretty much be back in that dominant position. And that sent a bit of a shockwave through the British government here. I've already talked about British dyes being formed. In 1919, there was a kind of watered down piece of legislation. Again, dramatic debates in Parliament about whether this was, whether we should have free trade or some kind of controls, whether certain dye stuff should be controlled. But in the end, as a kind of an appeasement, they put in this proclamation. And then in mid-1919, there's a further action of kind of trying, in their view, to strengthen the industry, bring it closer together, and have more R&D work done, employ more research chemists. They created the British Dyestuffs Corporation, and this brought together British Dyes Limited with Ellesmere into that bigger group. Now, of course, that wasn't the end of this kind of rationalisation of the industry, as many of you will know. And in 1926, we have Imperial Chemical Industries created by bringing together Brunamont, United Alkali Company, which obviously was very prominent here in Widnes, Runcorn, Widnes Bell Industries, and the British Dyestuffs Corporation. And the reasoning behind that was that the Germans had brought most of their major producers into a large combine, which was known as IG Farben. And the US companies had also developed enormously over that First World War period. At the beginning of the war, America was totally dependent, like us, on German synthetic dyes. But they took the opportunity during the First World War to really develop their own industry. And so we see major competitors at that point from DuPont and down. So what I hope I've given you at least a sense of is the German dominance of the synthetic dyestuff sector, looked a little at the kind of changes that had to be put in place in the early part of the 20th century, how the Ellesmere port Indigo works were first established and then how it was taken and put into British hands, the demands of World War I, and also, very briefly, the post-war consequences of the maritime sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Any pressing questions? I think we've got time for a quick couple of questions. Yes, fire away, Fred.
I'm slightly puzzled as to why Indigo was important in the war effort.
Well, my understanding was, from the reasons always given in debates, was it was used for uniforms, naval uniforms.
Oh,
in particular.
naval uniforms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was the main driver, I think. Sorry? Yeah.
So, Degussa were manufacturing, presumably the same product, so quite recently, weren't they, in Manchester?
When you say what product?
Indigo, was that Indigo that they were manufacturing?
I'm not sure what's happened
Well, it's
since.
very blue.
Yeah. I know, I've lost track of where Ellesmere Port Works actually went, but I know in the 60s and 70s there was a huge peak in production. I think this was to do with the kind of fashion, I don't wear it today, but denim, clothing. And interestingly, I mentioned during the talk that there'd been an interest in using natural indigo, and people who do a lot of their own dyeing for clothing, etc., actually went back and used natural indigo because they could vary the shades. But I don't know about the Degussa.
Well, they still had a factory in East Manchester, just
Right.
by the canal.
Yeah. What sort of date?
Well, it was 20 years ago.
Yeah. But I mean, the origins of
If you
it.
did work there, you came home blue.
Yeah.
Well, the Dolly Blue Works at Backbarrow.
Well, I guess I've been there as well, but
On my computer, the background to this presentation was a kind of mauve colour, indigo colour, but obviously, it is up here, but it's on there, it just lost that. It must, it's not replacing inaccuracy.
One quick question. There must have been acute labour shortage of chemists, given that the Germans and the Swiss had this tradition of training chemists, and we perhaps didn't have. We were much more dependent upon the sort of alkali sector training, or there just wasn't that kind of higher education. What did they do to overcome labour shortages? How did they manage to recruit chemists to work in this industry?
It is quite complex. I'm not using that as an excuse for not answering the question. But soon after the war started, they began to realise that there was a shortage of two groups, if I could put it, within the chemical industry. One was research chemists that could solve some of the problems over, processing routes and that kind of thing. And the other was simply workers who were used to working in the equipment. And so there was an act put in place that prevented or allowed companies to say, we actually need these various people. And you could get them given some designation. So they didn't in fact go out and fight on the battlefield, but helped the war effort from here, and particularly in our installation.
But there must have been acute competing claims, for instance, from the rapidly growing explosive sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I've just been up to a new museum called Devil's Porridge, which we were talking about before, and I'm not going to get into that now, but you think of 20,000 people were employed in Gretna at that time, with that one factory.
Joe, quick question.
Not a question, just a response to your question, where did they train? Manchester College of Technology Chemistry Department had a dedicated dyestuffs division with, I can't think of his first name, but Knecht was the professor, and he was training PhD students, and we have got now in the Manchester Library Archive books, patent and sample books of coloured, of dyed fabrics produced by Connect, and particularly by his PhD student Eva Hibbert. So
Yeah.
there was quite a significant programme of training going on there.
To the other big one, which I'm going to get into far, is Roscoe and
Yeah.
Owens College
Yeah.
and university.
So there was a response to the shortage of trained labour.
Yeah, but I think it was really difficult. I don't think the government realised quite when everyone was signing up to go and fight on the battlefield that there actually was something to be done back at home, and that caused them real problems.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank
Thank
you.